Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, the other day we did the story of the 369th U.S. Infantry, the men known as the Harlem Hellfighters from the First World War, and several of you suggested there might be some parallels to be seen with a unit from the Second World War, and I could not agree more. So today we are going to dive into the video by Simple History. It's called "What Was the Best U.S. Military Unit in World War II?" And I think their answer to this question is 100% right. Remember, World War II is a time when many Japanese Americans are put into basically concentration camps. They call them internment camps. And many of the men who were in these camps, in fact, about 1,500 of them, would go on to form the nucleus of this unit known as the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. It was made up of about 4,000 first-generation born Americans. These were children of Japanese immigrants who had come to the United States in the years before World War II, who had had children in America who were born American citizens, many of them interned in camps. And listen to the statistics from this unit. It was initially made up of about 4,000 men. That was their strength. Eventually, something about 10,000 men would serve in this unit when you figure replacements and things like that. This unit earned 4,000 Purple Hearts, 4,000 Bronze Stars, 8 Presidential Unit Citations. In fact, 5 were given in 1 month. That is just a ridiculously high number. 21 members of this unit were awarded the Medal of Honor, including probably their most famous man, Daniel Inouye, who would go on to be Hawaii's first congressman and serve for decades in the United States Senate. So today we're going to take a look at the story of the 442nd Regiment Combat Team. Just an amazing story when you think about people who were interned by their own country, who then go and fight for their country, and in fact actually have a part in liberating one of the concentration camps in Europe. Just an amazing story. So I'll put the link in the description below. As always, you can check out this story for yourself without my commentary. Let's dive in.
What was the most decorated U.S. combat unit in World War II? During World War II, the United States Army fought bravely on theaters across the entire world. For the gallantry shown in defeating the Axis powers, American soldiers received at least 1 million Purple Hearts. There was one unit, however, that stands out as the most decorated during World War II. It was the 442nd Infantry Regiment, with more than 15,000 awards and decorations. What's curious about this unit is that it consisted entirely of American volunteers of Japanese origin. Almost all Japanese Americans who fought in the U.S. Army during World War II were the so-called Nisei, or the second generation.
And so by second generation, what they mean is their parents immigrated. Their parents were born in Japan, and they are, it just depends on how you word it. You know, sometimes you can call them first generation Americans because they were the first generation in their family to be born there, but second generation Americans because their parents became Americans.
Were the children of Japanese-born immigrants in the United States. Most of them lived on the American West Coast and Hawaiian Islands. When America entered the war at the end of 1941 after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, West Coast Nisei and their families were forcibly interned by the proclamation of the notorious Executive Order 9066. Under this order, American residents with foreign enemy ancestry could be placed under surveillance, detained, and even relocated by military fiat. Almost 120,000 Americans of Japanese origins were put in 10 relocation centers, since the government categorized them as potential enemies, afraid of sabotage and spying.
And yeah, and most of the Japanese Americans in Hawaii were not interned, in part because Hawaii was already under martial law, so they had a level of security there that they didn't have on the West Coast. Not trying to justify it by any means whatsoever. And this law did technically allow for German and Italian immigrants to be detained as well, but it really was only used on Japanese Americans on the West Coast.
The situation was completely different in Hawaii, where there was no internment of Japanese Americans except important leaders. This was because Japanese Americans made up more than 1/3 of the entire archipelago population. However, martial law was introduced in the Hawaiian Islands. The Kibe were singled out for particularly harsh treatment. These were Japanese American citizens born in the United States who spent time for education or other purposes in Japan and then returned to live in Hawaii. Japanese Americans in Hawaii were allowed to remain in service of the Hawaii National Guard. However, members of the Hawaii National Guard were temporarily disarmed, and local ROTC students and cadets were dismissed from service. These former students and cadets formed a civilian aid group, the Varsity Victory Volunteers, or VVV, which provided the physical labor needed for the massive construction of U.S. military bases in the Pacific. It was from these men that the Hawaiian Provisional Battalion was formed. The Hawaiian Provisional Battalion was also formed from Japanese Americans from the Hawaii National Guard. This unit was a forerunner of the famous 1 Puka Puka, the 100th Infantry Battalion.
So I find myself in awe of these people, like the 369th Infantry in World War I, 442nd in World War II. These men who are so poorly treated by their own government and by their own fellow citizens, and yet not only rise up to serve, but serve so admirably that there are few who can rival them. And I wonder if part of that is because there was such a desperate need to prove yourself to your fellow Americans, to prove that you could be trusted with this, to prove that you were capable, and to go above and beyond, like to do more because of your situation. I don't know.
In early 1943, in spite of strong opposition, the government decided to call Japanese Americans to colors and to form a special combat team. By making such a decision, the government wanted to show that all citizens were equal in their rights and duties, and that Japanese Americans
I don't know about rights, but
were as loyal as any other American. As well as this, inclusion of Japanese Americans in service was a counter-propaganda maneuver against the Imperial Japanese claims that America was fighting a race war in the Far East. Even though it was initially planned to have a higher engagement of volunteers from mainland citizens, their patriotic enthusiasm was hindered by the internment policy. The number of potential volunteers, therefore, was much higher in Hawaii. The initial plan to engage 3,000 volunteers from the mainland and 1,500 from Hawaii ultimately resulted with 10,000 volunteers from Hawaii and 1,182 from the mainland. As devised by the government, these men would only fight in the European theater of war. It seemed that the loyalty of the Nisei soldiers was not as indisputable as the government claimed.
Well, and not only that, but you also have to worry a little bit about the recognition factor. I hate to say it, but I mean, if you're fighting against the Japanese and you are fighting alongside of people of Japanese descent, say your guys get captured, what's going to happen? And you might worry too that what the Japanese soldiers would do to people that they maybe saw as traitors to their cause.
The order forming the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, issued on January 22, 1943, defined that all soldiers must be American citizens of Japanese ancestry residing in the United States since birth. Field grade officers, on the other hand, were to be white American citizens. Other officer types were allowed to be of Japanese origin.
So by field grade officers, you're talking about the officers who are in command of the regiment or of battalions, right? So we're talking colonel, lieutenant colonel, major, things like that.
42nd Regimental Combat Group was activated in Camp Shelby, Mississippi on February 1, 1943. The first commanding officer of the group was Lieutenant Colonel Charles W. Pence. The 442nd went through basic training at Camp Shelby, the same camp where the 100th Infantry Battalion was deployed. These two units spent some time in the camp together until August 1943, when the 100th was deployed to Italy. The 442nd continued its training until the end of the year. After that, group units were sent to field maneuvers, where they showed excellent performance. During all that time, the 442nd was sending replacements to the 100th from their own 1st Battalion. When the time came for the 442nd to leave Europe, the 1st Battalion was almost completely depleted. On April 22nd, the 442nd Regimental Combat Group left Camp Shelby and went to Hampton Roads Port of Embarkation. The strength of the group was reduced by the depleted 1st Battalion, whose staff remained in Camp Shelby to train replacements. The 442nd arrived at the port of Naples on May 28, 1944. They were immediately attached to the 34th Division, while the 100th, 1 Puka Puka, was put under their command to replace the missing 1st Battalion.
So, I mean, this is right as things are really hot in Italy, right? They're arriving in late May. This is going to be just before D-Day is happening over on the shores of Normandy in France. And the Allies are moving up the Italian peninsula, and there's going to be some of the fiercest fighting of the war is going to be taking place here in 1944, and these guys are going to be thrown right into it.
On August 10, 1944, the 100th was officially attached as a battalion to the 442nd Regimental Combat Group. They were to replace the missing 1st Battalion, but were allowed to retain their designation because of their previous combat history and the respect they had gained. By the time of the arrival of the 442nd, the 100th already built a respectable reputation. After their arrival to Italy in September 1943, they had been engaged in numerous battles. Their most famous engagement was in the Battle of Monte Cassino, where they earned the nickname of the Purple Heart Battalion.
Yep.
The bravery they showed on the slopes of Monte Cassino was dearly paid. Out of an
Monte Cassino, if you ever look at pictures of the formidable obstacle that unit is, how high up it is, or that location is, you can see why it was so fiercely fought over and why it was just repeatedly bombed. And it's a great historic site as well. But, you know, you may be familiar from hearing about it in Band of Brothers, because right as they're about to jump on Normandy, Bill Garnier very famously gets a letter telling him that his brother has been killed at Monte Cassino.
Initial 1,300 men, the 100th was reduced after Monte Cassino to just 521 soldiers. For their bravery in Monte Cassino, the unit was awarded the Distinguished Unit Citation, later known as the Presidential Unit Citation. The first combat engagement for the 442nd and 100th took place on June 26, 1944, in the town of Belvedere, Italy. In their very first engagement, soldiers of the 442nd showed that they were to be a mighty force to contend with. In a coordinated attack, the 100th, 2nd, and 3rd Battalion attacked the well-defended town and managed to break the heavy German resistance, destroying the entire battalion there.
Wow.
In the next period, the unit continued the advance along the western coast of the Italian peninsula, all the way to the city of Livorno. On the hills above the city, the Germans made their last stand and defended this important point. This time, the 442nd Infantry Regiment fought in coordination with the 552nd Field Artillery Battalion.
So by this point in the war, Italy has basically dropped out. And so the Allies are primarily fighting Germans in Italy. It's a place that the Germans know they can't afford to lose. And even though they've lost their Italian allies, they recognize that they've got to slow the Allies down there as much as possible, or else the southern defense of Germany is in trouble.
All the engineers of the 232nd Engineer Company were making sure to keep the supply roads accessible. For 3 days, the Germans resisted, but eventually lost the battle. By liberating Livorno, the Allies gained access to an important port for their future operations in Italy. After Livorno, the 442nd Combat Group went to the rear for a deserved rest. Their Italian tour of duty finished in September 1944 as they secured the Arno River as part of the drive against the Gothic Line. At the end of September, the entire combat group was moved to the Naples region, where on the 26th of September, they boarded Coast Guard transports and sailed to France. In Italy, men of the 442nd showed that they were right to be called to arms, but it was in France that they showed what they were truly made of. The entire combat team disembarked near Marseille and immediately went north to the front of the 7th Army near Epinal. After playing a significant...
So let's talk about what we mean by where they're fighting right now. So it was originally called Operation Anvil. The idea being, okay, the landings at Normandy happened. Now we're going to do a secondary landing on the opposite end of France, over on the Mediterranean coast in the southeast part of the state, or of the country. Launching, you can see here in the bottom left, going from Italy, where they've moved the line up far north of Rome, and you go from Italy across Corsica, Sardinia, and land over around Marseille, which is one of the largest cities in France. But I think they changed it to Operation Dragoon. But then this is where you're opening up that other front. You've got the U.S. 7th Army down there, and it's meant to just put a lot of pressure on the Germans, because now you've got Italy, you've got, of course, the Eastern Front with the Soviets, you've got fighting going on in the Balkans, you've got Normandy, and now you've got this additional front, and the Germans just can't be everywhere at once.
Role in the battle for Bruyères, the 442nd was relieved and went to Belmont for rest, which wouldn't last long. On October 27th, the entire combat team was called to the front line to relieve pressure on the 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment, 36th Infantry, Texas Division. The 1st Battalion was assaulting enemy positions along the heavily wooded ridge only to find itself cut off. In the history of World War II, this unit was known as the Lost Texas Battalion.
Yeah, there was a Lost Battalion in World War II, and these are the guys that are called to go relieve the Lost Battalion.
442nd rushed the same day to the ridge and launched an attack against the well-fortified enemy. The progress was very slow this day, mainly because the narrow terrain and thick forest allowed little maneuver. On top of that, they had to fight off the German counterattack, supported by a Mark IV tank and an armored car. The following day was not much different. The Germans were showing fierce resistance. Their artillery and mortar fire was pouring shell fire from above constantly. With shells exploding high in the trees, the 442nd were exposed to tree bursts from which they couldn't find protection. It was only during the night that the soldiers of the 442nd could take rest from the enemy fire.
This is one of the real dangers of having to fight in the woods. You know, we see that with Bastogne for the 101st Airborne Division, is that these artillery shells are intentionally meant to explode. They're timed to explode over their targets, not only because it rains shrapnel down on them. And this isn't new. This is how, despite what you see in movies, this is how shrapnel was supposed to work in the American Civil War, was to explode over their heads, not to hit the ground and blow them up into the air. But this turned the trees into additional shrapnel, and so it magnified the effectiveness of your artillery to have it burst in the trees overhead. So I can imagine anytime these guys went into combat in trees and they were facing artillery, that had to have been a scary, scary situation.
If it wasn't for the rain and very low temperatures that kept them awake. On October 29th, the 442nd continued their attack on the enemy. A platoon of tanks arrived as support. However, whatever approach they made, they were repelled by the Germans. At the moment when defeating the enemy seemed impossible, the word came that the Lost Battalion was in a desperate situation. If they were to be saved, someone had to do it immediately. At that point, Nisei soldiers of the 442nd decided to follow their motto, go for broke, waging everything on one roll of the dice. I and K companies of the 3rd Battalion fixed their bayonets and charged the impenetrable enemy positions, screaming Banzai! Completely surprised by this daring and bold move, the Germans started to flee their positions. A 2-day job was done by 2 Nisei companies in just 2 hours.
Wow, good for them.
The attack was followed by a maneuver of the 2nd Battalion, who managed to strike the Germans from their left flank. The 30th, 3rd, and 100th continued their advance, and by the afternoon managed to establish a connection with the Lost Battalion. Even though the Texans were saved, the battle for the ridge continued. When the 442nd was relieved on November 8th, they had been severely depleted. The average company strength was now only 35 men. The
average company strength of just 35 men. These companies are typically, I think, around 150 or so should have made up a full-strength company. So they're down to like 1/4 of their normal strength.
French campaign went on until March 1945, when the 442nd held positions in the Maritime Alps. It was a relatively quiet region on the French-Italian border near the Mediterranean Sea. There was action, but it was far from what the 442nd had suffered in earlier campaigns. On March 16th, French troops replaced the 442nd, who now left for Marseille to board the ships on their way back to Italy. The 552nd Field Artillery Battalion, however, was detached, as they were sent back to help other units, including the 7th Army. They would go on to be one of the units to liberate the Dachau camp. Now, battle-hardened, the 442nd Regimental Combat Group arrived in early April in Italy and moved inland.
So I hope they're going to tell, yeah, we've got about 3 minutes left, which really can't do justice to Daniel Inouye's story, but we'll see how much they tell of it, and then I'll try to fill in the gaps where I can.
They were back in Pisa, which they liberated 8 months earlier. Their task was to attack the right flank of the German defense in the Po River Valley in order to ease the forthcoming offensive of the 5th Army. They would fight alongside the 92nd Infantry Division, the only segregated African-American active combat unit of the U.S. Army in Europe. As well as this were British and French colonial troops and the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, which also...
So yeah, unfortunately, he makes reference there to the fact that, by and large, black infantry soldiers were not put in combat situations. Now, as the war progressed, that did begin to change somewhat. There's an example is the field artillery unit, the heavy artillery that ended up, they were recruited from men who were in service jobs like cooks and mechanics, things like that. And they formed this field artillery battalion who, I think it was a battalion, might have been a smaller unit, who ended up being captured, and several of them were massacred in what became known as the Wereth 11. They were these 11 black combat soldiers who were captured during the Battle of the Bulge and tortured, brutally tortured and executed by the Germans. And it was only found out much later, several weeks later, when their bodies were discovered, what had happened to them.
Also had Japanese soldiers in its ranks. In their distinctive manner, soldiers of the 442nd gave a significant contribution in clearing the Tuscan-Emilian Apennines region between La Spezia and Genoa. The German enemy were still resisting fiercely, but it was clear that their ultimate defeat was just a matter of days away. The old Italian city of Genoa fell on April 28th. From there, the Allies had an open road to Turin and Milan. On May 2nd, the last German units in Italy surrendered, and the war was over for the 442nd. When speaking of the 442nd Regimental Combat Group, their records also include operations of the 100th Battalion before it was attached to the 442nd. During the 20 months from September 1943 until May 1945, around 18,000 soldiers served in the unit. They were awarded with more than 15,000 awards and decorations, including 21 Medals of Honor.
It should be pointed out, those Medals of Honor were not awarded until the presidency of Bill Clinton, I think like around the year 2000. So much like what happened with the men of the Harlem Hellfighters, those awards did not come right away. And I want to specifically talk about, well, let's let him finish the video in case he does mention Dan Inouye.
9 Distinguished Service Crosses, 1 Distinguished Service Medal, 588 Silver Star Medals, 22 Legion of Merit Medals, 15 Soldiers Medals, 5,200 Bronze Star Medals, 9,486 Purple Hearts.
So the numbers that he's reading obviously refer to units beyond just the specific 442nd, because he's talking about the 100th, for example. So the numbers I read at the beginning, I think, were specific to the 442nd.
36 Army Commendation Medals, 87 Division Commendations, 7 Presidential Unit Citations, 2 Meritorious Service Unit Commendations, and a Congressional Gold Medal awarded on November 2nd, 2011. This made the 442nd Regimental Combat Unit the most decorated of all U.S. Army units in World War II.
Okay, so let me tell you a little bit of the story of Daniel Inouye. Here's the actual Medal of Honor citation. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, 2nd Lieutenant Daniel Inouye, and it should be pointed out, he started out as an enlisted man. He earned a battlefield commission because of his service. So he wasn't somebody who started out as an officer. And he ends up a captain by the end of the war. He rises all the way through the ranks. Distinguished himself by extraordinary heroism in action 21st April 1945. We're talking like a couple of weeks before the end of the war in Europe. He skillfully directed his platoon through a hail of automatic weapon and small arms fire in a swift enveloping movement that resulted in the capture of an artillery and mortar post and brought his men to within 40 yards of the hostile force. So he crawls up a treacherous slope within 5 yards of the machine gun and hurled 2 grenades, destroying the emplacement. Before the enemy could retaliate, he stood up and neutralized the second machine gun nest. Wounded by a sniper's bullet, he continued to engage other hostile positions at close range until an exploding grenade shattered his right arm. So let me tell you exactly what happened here, because my understanding is the grenade didn't actually explode. It was fired it was a rifle grenade, and it was fired, but it was at such close range and with such force that it actually mostly severed his arm. And he actually had a grenade in his hand when it hit his arm and knocked it off. And the contraction of the muscles that actually held the grenade, even though he had lost his arm. And his men came up to try and help him, and he waved him off. And he actually reached down and pried the grenade out of his own hand that had been severed, his arm that had been severed from his body, pulled it out and threw it at the enemy. This is the kind of intense focus this guy had in this moment. In the attack, 25 soldiers were killed and 8 others captured. By his gallant, aggressive tactics and by his indomitable leadership, 2nd Lieutenant Inoue enabled his platoon to advance through formidable resistance and was instrumental to capture of the ridge. So while he's recovering in the hospital after the war, and there's a cool picture of this. I think these guys are playing poker. You see this young kid, Daniel Inoue, and you see another severely wounded soldier who had not lost an arm, but had lost the use of an arm, named Robert Dole. And Dan Inoue and Bob Dole become friends. And Bob Dole's talking about how after the war he wants to go into politics, and that inspires Dan Inoue to want to do the same thing. And these two guys who met in the hospital after both being gravely wounded in the service of their country, both end up going to the United States Senate and served for decades together in the Senate and were lifelong friends, even though one was a Republican and one was a Democrat. Just such a cool story. I encourage you to read more, and I want to learn more about this amazing unit of Japanese Americans who served so bravely and so fiercely during the war. So let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. Let's add to the conversation. Tell me more about this unit, what you know. Some of you I know probably know a lot more about this unit than I do. I would love to learn. Let's learn together. Thanks for watching.